Hello everyone and welcome back to DJ Tutorials. This is part 7, Eevee. We're going to be rendering this out using the Eevee render engine. And we're going to just be doing some basic stuff here so that we can get this thing rendered out and get you guys going. So at this point, what we're going to do is we're going to make some changes. So go to your render settings here, and you're going to make sure that the Eevee engine is selected. And we're just going to talk about a couple properties here. So if you take a look at this area over here, you can see that it's doing certain samples for our render. So the viewport, which is this right here, is currently doing 16 samples, and the number of samples basically means how many times it will run the render to get more and more detail. Eevee's engine is pretty efficient. 16 samples looks pretty good as it is. It's very clean due to the way that it's a raster engine. But we're going to turn on a couple things here. So we're going to leave the render at 64. You can change that if you want, but really this is fine. We're going to turn on this button here. It says Ambient Occlusion. And before I turn it on, I'm going to zoom in a little bit and I'll show you what it does. So if I click that on, and if we zoom around a bit, let's see if we can actually, it's not as apparent. Let's turn on the distance, and it's a little bit hard to see. You can kind of see it from here. So turning this off and then turning it back on, if you take the distance and you increase it, you can see that the cone here is now getting shadow on it. Basically, what the ambient occlusion does is it looks at objects that are around it and it will add shadow and change the shadow of how the it's kind of hard to explain a little bit. You kind of have to look up the definition of it and all that kind of stuff, and I really don't want to do that. It basically just adds shadows in between objects that are in your scene, and that's pretty much what it does. Now, this is a pretty big ambient occlusion distance, which we really don't need for this, so we're just going to keep it at, let's say, a 0.5 or something like that, and we'll just keep it on just because if we take a look really close down here, at this cylinder, if you turn it off and then turn it back on, you can see that there is a bit of shadow that's being added there. So again, it has to do with the shadows in between objects, and it makes it that much more realistic for this particular type of engine. So hopefully you're seeing that change there. Trace precision, you can just leave it as it is. You really don't need to pull this all the way up. It'll be fine just like that. The next thing that we're going to look at is this thing called bloom. If we turn it on, and let's look through here. If we turn it on and turn it off, you'll see, and depending on how bright your lights are in your scene, you'll see this. If you turn it on, you'll see that there's a glow effect, and if you turn it off, you'll see that it's very sharp without that sort of like blurred glow. Now, bloom is okay. You might go, wow, that looks really neat. We're actually going to be adding a glow effect to the scene in post because it works a bit better. The way that Eevee samples this bloom, I don't think is very accurate. And when you render out images, it's a little bit unpredictable sometimes. So we're going to leave that off for now. Don't worry about depth of field. We're going to be doing something else to create a depth of field look without actually putting it in the camera data. Let's go to this one right here, which is probably the most important one for Eevee. So you're going to turn this on, and it's called Screen Space Reflections. And if we turn that on, you should see immediately that there is a change. And what it does is it's now looking at the objects in the scene and it's reflecting those objects. So our cube before had really no reflections to speak of. And when we turn it on, you can now see that the floor is being reflected and the cylinder is being reflected. And this is why I told you guys, don't really mess with your materials until we get to the render part of this tutorial series, because this will now change your sort of like impression or view of the materials you have. And at this point, you may want to go in and tweak some of your materials, but I'm going to leave them as is. We're not going to do motion blur because we're not doing an animation for this, and we're not really moving anything in the scene, so we're not worried about that. What we're going to do is we're going to go down to shadows here, and we're going to just check this box that says high bit depth. And what that does is it will allow the calculation of your shadows to just have a little bit more refinement. Now there's other stuff here that's cube size and the cascade size. Be careful with this if you have a more modest build of your computer, because the changes of these can actually slow down how everything's calculated. If we increase the cube size to 4096 or like a 4K, you can kind of see there's this ringing effect here. And if we change the cascade size to 4096, you can see that there's just a little bit of changes. If we change the cascade size to 64, not that much difference. Cube size to 64, now you're seeing kind of more pixelated um, shadows. And if you play around with these, you can get some different effects. I'm just going to leave it as it was, which I think is this right here, 512 by 1024. So that's going to work just fine. And really what you want to do is just make sure that you have this high bit depth selected and the soft shadows selected here. The next thing that we're going to do is we're actually going to turn on the contact shadows for all of our lamps in the scene for this particular engine. You kind of have to do this in order for it to read some of the um, uh, cast shadows and stuff like that. So now you notice that I don't have any of the overlays. That's because I turned this off, and you can turn this on and off just by clicking this button right here. And I'm just going to keep them off just so that I get a really nice view of our scene. And if over here in the left panel, I click on my key light and you go to the object data properties right here, click this little down arrow here, and click on contact shadows, and do that for all of the rest of your lighting. And again, this is just stuff that you kind of have to do for this engine. It does add a little bit of realism to the scene uh, when you add these, when you change these settings. So just for now, believe me, and just click these certain things on just to make your scene look a little bit more nice. Okay, so now we're pretty much going to be ready to do a render. So let's hit 0 to go to our camera view here. And let's save our session, File Save, and let's hit F12. Now you can go to Render, Render Image, but you can see right there, hotkey is F12. So render the image and a new window should open up, and here you can see we have our scene fully rendered out. Yours might have taken a little bit more time, mine took 1 second, and it looks fine. Now, we rendered this out, and if we look in really close, if we zoom way in, it gets a little pixelated pretty quick. And that's because we rendered this just at 1500 by 2000. Now, generally speaking, if you're going to deliver this at 1500 pixels by 2000 pixels, which is a pretty nice size, what you really want to do is you want to double that size and then scale it down later. And this is what I mean. 1500 by 2000. Let's take movies for example. 1920 by 1080. If you're working on a movie like a film and you're doing CGI for it, and you're rendering out your final CGI monster or whatever it is at 1920 by 1080, it's not going to look great. It's not going to have high detail. When they shoot film on video or on an actual film camera, they're taking a very large image print and they end up scaling that down to 4K and 1920 by 1080. So it looks a lot cleaner, it looks a lot crisper. The grain and the noise is a lot less noticeable, things like that. And what we are really wanting to do is increase our pixel density. And how you do that is by simply going over here to this percentage right here in our output properties, click this, change it to 200. And what we're going to be rendering now is 3000 by 4000 pixels. So it's the same ratio. It's still 15 by 20, but it's now 2 times the size, which means that on our final image, once we scale it down, it's going to look a lot tighter and a lot cleaner. And this is a really old school way of doing this. Painters back in the day, when they were doing collector's cards and things like that, you would paint it on a board that would be, a lot bigger than the final collector's card, and then they would digitally, or however they did it back then, they would shrink down the image and it would have a lot tighter of a look to it. The easiest example I can give you is a stamp. A stamp is not rendered at the small size it is. It's rendered at a much higher resolution or a larger image and then scaled down to what you end up seeing. So what we do here, just change that to 200, hit F12 again, or go to render, render image. And it should take a little bit longer, but not too bad because this render engine is pretty quick, even on a more modest build. And now we have a much more refined and tighter render here. And if you zoom in, you can see a lot more detail, and it's just overall a much more clean image. Now, if that kind of broke your computer, you can pop that down to 150 if you want, or if you want even a more higher resolution, you can hit 300 or 250%, whatever you want to do, it's fine. But everything else after is going to take a while, so just keep that in mind. So now we have this render here, and you can go to Image, Save As, and you can save that somewhere. Make sure that you change this to 0 compression and save it as an 8-bit color depth PNG. But before we do that, you can feel free to do that right now if you want. But before we do that, we're actually going to add some effects to it in the Compositing tab. So go over here, click on Compositing, and don't be scared. This is going to be fairly easy, and we're going to add some depth of field look and some glow effects, and you're really going to like it. So click on Use Nodes, and we'll zoom out a bit. Pull this over here. Pull this over here. And we're going to hit Shift A, and we're going to look for the viewer right here. So go to Output, Viewer, and put that over here. And if you take this right here, the image, and this is just like the nodes that we were using earlier with the shader, left click and drag this over to the viewer, you can see that now our image is in the background of this, of the node compositor here. And we can change the size of this by going over here to View, this tab right over here, go to View, Zoom, and just left click and drag that down. And now, if you, I'm just going to move this here for a second so I can show you. If you zoom in and out, the image stays the same, okay? Click on Viewer right here, and you can now click on this X. Ooh, that's weird. I haven't seen that before. Click and drag it over here to the right, and then you can scale it up and down over here. So now that you've set your sort of viewer where you'd like to see it over here on the left, what we're going to be doing is adding a couple compositing elements to this scene to make it look just a little bit better. So the first thing that we're going to be doing is we're going to be adding a defocus node. So if we go to Filter, go down to Defocus, and pop that right here. It looks a little daunting, don't worry. And if we take a look at our image here, the render layers node here that came out, we have an image, then we have an alpha, and if I throw that into the viewer, it's all white because we have a full image here. There's no outlines of anything with a, transparent background or anything like that. Let's put the image back in here. And then we have this right here called depth. And if we pipe that into the viewer here, it doesn't look like anything. And that's because the values are so small and the changes of the gradation is so minute that it's really hard to see those changes. Let's just take that out of there and put back in the image. And what we're going to do is we're going to actually do what's called normalizing this data so that we can actually see what's in the depth channel, because we're going to use that to drive the defocus here. So if you hit Shift A and you go to, let's just search for it, look for normalize right here, not normal, but normalize. Pop that here, take the depth, move it into this node, take the value here and pipe that into the Z. Then take your image here and pipe that into the defocus, and then take this and put it into your viewer. Now you don't see anything just yet, but if I actually take the normalize, and you could just watch me, take the normalize and I pop it into the viewer, you'll see that now we can actually see some information over here. And this is basically saying 0 is the front, or the closest to camera, and white is the furthest away. And we're going to be using this to tell this defocus node where the focus will be placed and what will be out of focus. So if we take this defocus, pop it into the viewer, and I'm actually going to move it into the composite right here and open up so I can actually show you a little bit closer here. Um, this is the window that opened up. And if I take the Z scale here, and I'm just going to increase this to something crazy like 200, and then I pull this back over, you'll notice that now there's a defocus put on this entire scene. But it's not really what we want. We really want like the center to be in focus and the background and maybe the foreground to be out of focus. So how we're going to control this normalize is we're going to hit Shift A to add, go to converter, converter, color ramp, put that right in here, and then take that color ramp and we're going to look at it through the viewer. And for me, I'm going to look at it through the composite so that I can actually see what I'm doing a little bit closer. So you can see here, here's the image. And let's actually do something like this. So maybe something like this for now. And so it's really big over here. If I take this black and I slide it to the right, you'll see here that it's now changing the black value. It's moving it further into the scene. And if I pull that back and I pull the white to the left, you'll see that's pulling the background closer. And since white equals defocused and black equals in focus, we want to set this black to be somewhere right about in here so that the ball is kind of in focus and the cube is, at least that's how I'm going to set it up, and the background is a little bit more defocused. Now for this far foreground here, we're going to hit the plus button right here. We're going to add one of these little flags to the ramp. I'm going to pull that over to the left, and you can see now there is white up here. And we're going to change that more to like a darker gray, just so that it's not too defocused, something like maybe like that. And now when we look through the defocus node, and I'm going to put in both of these so we can see, you can see that now there's a nice little defocus effect happening in the scene. Next thing we're going to do here is we're going to add a glare. So filter, glare, and this is going to add, if you take the defocus and you pop that into here, this is going to add a sort of glow effect to our scene. Now sometimes because the defocus node, there might be a couple weird sort of things going on, but hopefully they will not be an issue. And we'll find a way to fix it if there is. Okay, so it starts off with streaks, and I'm not going to go into super detail on how this works, but we're going to change this out from streaks to fog glow. And then you're going to take the mix, and we're going to pull this all the way over to the right. And what that does is it sort of gives us an idea about where the glow effect is happening. And you can see there's quite a bit of it here and a little bit of it over here. But I'm actually going to increase the amount of glow that's happening. I'm going to take the threshold and I'm going to set it to a 0.8, which will grab a little bit more of everything. And I'm not sure how this is going to end up. We'll see. Change the size to a 9, because this will have a larger sort of glow effect. You can see right there, it added that a larger glow effect. Then take this mix and hit 0. And now there's an added glow effect there and a little bit of a glow effect added there. If you pull this mix all the way over to -1, you get the original image before the glow effect was added, just like that. If you hit 0, it's in between. So it's basically adding exactly the glow effect, and it's basically just adding that to your image. And if you pull it all the way over to 1, it's just the glow map, so to speak. And if you change this from medium to low, you'll get a lower quality glow effect. I mean, they call it lower quality, but sometimes you get a better effect using low. And if you go to high, you'll get a more high definition glow effect to this. It does take a little bit longer, so keep that in mind when you're doing this. You can see right there, it's taking a little bit of time to composite, and there we go. So change the mix back to a 0. And I just hit enter there just to, have it actually added. And now we've added a little bit of a glow effect to our scene. Now the other thing, and this is optional, all of this is really optional. If you wanted to just save out the straight up render without doing this defocus and stuff, totally fine, that's up to you. It's actually a little bit, I can see a little bit of a change here in how this is doing this. So I'm actually going to change this mix to a -0.3 and see if that helps that, because I don't really like this orange look that it's giving right here. And let's actually take the threshold and let's put it at a 0.9, because I actually don't like how it's adding that orangey look. Yours might look a little bit different. This is just my preference. There's other things you can do with this to make it a little bit more high class and all that kind of stuff, but this is just a quick effect. So the next thing that we're going to do, and again, this is totally optional, we're going to add a little bit of a lens distortion and some aberration to it so that it looks a little bit more realistic, like a real photograph. So if we hit Shift A here and we go to distort this time, lens distortion, take the image here, pop it into the image here, and I'll take this and put it in both the viewer and the composite. And what you want to do is you want to click this one right here that says fit, distort, just do just a little one. We just want a little bit of a lens distortion, so a 0.01. And if you watch the updater here, there you go. There's a little bit of a lens distortion that just happened there where everything kind of bubbled out just a little bit. Then for the dispersion, and I'll put this pretty high so you can see what it does. I'll put this at a 0.1. This adds a little bit of like a chromatic aberration, basically, or some color effects on the edges that happens when you take a photo of something. So if we look really closely here, you can see that there's this sort of like greenish outline, and the edges are a little bit distorted. And a 0.1 is a lot. You really don't want that unless you're going for a specific look, and you can see how sort of distorted it starts to look. We're just going to put that as a 0.01. And there you go. So just a touch, a little bit of a aberration there, or a dispersion effect on the edges of our objects, and it just overall has a little bit more of a finished look to the image. Go into here, this window that opened up when you hit the render. If this does go away, that's okay. You can go over to the rendering tab here, and it's the same thing. And you can actually change this, so like if you click to here and you go to viewer node, it will actually update what's in your viewer node instead of just the compositing output node. So up to you on how you want to do that. Either way, make sure that you go in there, you hit image, save as, and we are going to call this step 7 Eevee comp. And we'll call this V2 since this is the second time I'm doing this series recordings. And then I am going to save a pre-comped version. You might have already done this. I'm going to put this into the composite here. And, let me just disconnect this viewer so it doesn't do the compositing. And this was our pre, so save this as a pre-comp. Step 7 Eevee comp V2, and this is going to be pre-comp. And, oh, I forgot to do this. I'll have to do this again. So it automatically will have these settings. I don't want this to be compressed. I want it to be I want the full quality here. RGBA, 8-bit color depth. You don't need 16 for what we're doing here. Unless you want to do a print, 16 will be fine, but this is just going to be online. So I'm doing 8-bit color depth, compression 0, and I'm going to save over, or I'm just going to save this here. So save as image. And then one more time, I will save the comped version. And here on the screen, you should be able to see now a difference between the two versions. One has, hopefully, in your opinion, a little bit more of a refined look to it, feels a little bit more finalized, and the other one looks like it just came straight out of the render engine. So that's going to be it on this one, which is basically a pseudo crash course, if you want to call it, for using a couple compositor nodes and rendering out of Eevee. Hopefully you learned something. And in the next two parts that I'm going to be sending out, I'm going to be showing you how to use the Cycles render engine for rendering and also adding IES light textures to give your scene more added realism. And then the Radeon Pro Render version that's going to show you how to use a completely different render engine to create your scene and render it out. And you'll see some of the benefits there. So, again, if you like this series and you like this channel, please hit the like button and subscribe. And leave your comments or questions down below and let me know how things are going. And I will see you guys in the next part.